Staring down in resignation at the plate that had been placed before him, Heinrich Zobel sighed heavily before taking up his cutlery. Not for the first time, he made a pledge that once the war was done with, he would never again allow himself to dine on trout, unless under the most dire of circumstance. But with every other animal in the area long since hunted to extinction, the country's national dish had now become the staple diet of his ailing command. Gazing out through the window at the pair of warships moored up alongside the docks, he paused to acknowledge that for a second, life could still be worse. For the crews of the two German cruisers, penned into their remote Norwegian fjord, lacking the fuel or supplies required for any meaningful sortie, the future looked bleak. Because whilst it seemed the Führer had angrily deemed his surface fleet unfit for battle, their ability to divert enemy resources away from other areas still made them useful to him. As a result, the pair had now become little more to the Kreigsmarine than counters in an unending game of cat and mouse with their allied opponents. Floating bullseyes, forever the subject of increasingly escalating air attacks, which in turn required ever more creative methods in order to survive. The knock at the door had been unexpected, less so than the bearded stranger who had then strode confidently into his office, followed by his adjutant. Zobel had not been anticipating a visitor, particularly one as dishevelled as this, bedecked in a heavy fur-lined overcoat that had clearly seen better days. He'd begun to berate his NCO, demanding the explanation, the meaning of the intrusion, whilst the visitor settled down before him, before smiling warmly. All of a sudden, the German officer's anger had begun to fade away, replaced instead by a growing sense of curiosity, as he had listened on to what the man had to say. How he was a friend of Germany, and could lead the captain and his men to a drop site, where a British commando team would be arriving later that evening. For the briefest of moments it occurred to Zobel to ask how the stranger had come by this information, before his visitor seemed to sense the question forming in the officer's mind. Before it could be vocalised, the man smiled again, the thought suddenly disappearing from Zobel's mind, replaced instead by overpowering feelings of confidence and excitement. Pushing his plate to one side, he gave orders that the gates be put on alert, and that the company be prepared to accompany him and his guest out into the adjoining countryside. Trying to ignore the whipping and burning sensation as the surrounding foliage had attacked his hands and face, Mitchell continued to run as fast as he could. The uncharacteristic bout of hesitation he'd experienced in the Sterling that had been transporting his unit had turned out to be the factor that had saved his life. For each second he had inexplicably stood and waited, further distance was added between himself and his fellow paratroopers, who had already left the aircraft ahead of him. Having finally jumped, he had still been peering down into the night, struggling to see the open chutes of his fellow soldiers, when the sky below was suddenly alive with gunfire. Several HMGs had simultaneously opened up from the ground below, directing a wave of deadly fire right into the centre of the descending commandos. Yanking down hard on the straps of his parachute, he tried to pull away from the carnage, tears filling his eyes as one chute after another had torn and dropped away below him. Somehow, his frantic efforts had paid off, with the guns drawing silence several moments later, the enemy soldiers around the drop site apparently unaware of his presence. The second he'd hit the ground, he'd immediately discarded the parachute, breaking into a run, carelessly leaving the rest of his gear along with it in the process. Now, armed with little more than a pistol and bayonet, Mitchell was running blindly through the dreariness of the Norwegian woods, his only thought being to put as much distance as possible between himself and the ambush site. Without warning, his right boot had suddenly connected with something hard and unyielding, the resultant impact sending him crashing forwards onto the forest floor. For a second he'd lain still, his ears desperately trying to detect any suggestion he'd been heard, before cautiously rising back up to his feet again. It was at that moment he caught sight of a shadowy figure, stood several metres away, staring directly at him. Raising the pistol, he shouted a challenge, ordering the watcher to step forward, to identify himself. A gravelly and reassuring voice had replied, stating that it meant no harm, announcing an intention to turn on a torch. There had been a slight and tense delay before the figure had then been illuminated by the device it held, stepping forwards to greet him, reassuringly stating that everything would be fine. Whilst the older man continued to speak, Mitchell tried his hardest not to stare at the eye patch that covered his right eye. To have been noticed to do so would have been considered ungentlemanly, an odd concern perhaps given the predicament he found himself in. After sharing some food with a paratrooper and a swig of something strong from the hip flask he carried, the man had identified himself as a member of the Milorg. He explained how he had been en route to meet the British unit, only to find the landing zone surrounded by Germans as he drew near. Realising he must try and issue a warning, he had searched for higher ground in order to send some kind of signal before the ambush had erupted behind him. Thanking the resistance fighter for his kindness, Mitchell began to question about what to do next, how he and his people could get him out of the country, back to England. But the older man had shaken his head firmly, urging the soldier to proceed with his mission, to sabotage the defences around the two enemy ships ahead of the planned air raid. Mitchell immediately began to protest, citing his lack of equipment and how the plans of his commanding officer and NCO had died along with them. But as the grizzled resistance man shook his head slowly, raising a hand to silence him, the Englishman found his protests dying away. Smiling warmly, the fighter removed a satchel from his back, opening it to reveal explosives, which he stated he'd intended to pass on to Mitchell's unit. The paratrooper must press home his attack. Lives were depending on it, perhaps more than he realised. How acting alone, with the morning mists to shroud his approach, he stood a better chance of infiltrating the German base, where the two cruisers lay. How a diversionary attack by the Milorg representative and his fellow fighters would ensure there would be no sentries to block his way. And the more the Norwegian spoke, the more the frightened paratrooper began to find himself believing that somehow he may still stand the remotest chance of success. As he crept silently through the fog, further up into the hillside that surrounded the German base, Private Mitchell offered a silent prayer of thanks to the old man. True to his word, when the pair had arrived at the perimeter fencing, the guards the Englishman expected to see waiting for them were nowhere to be found. Now, he made his way quickly along the ground above the docks, blocking up each of the dispensers he encountered that were used by the enemy to generate their artificial fog. Keenly aware the mist that hid his work would soon burn off with the approaching dawn, he'd sabotaged as many of the devices as he dared before pushing on, down into the base itself. Here again, the paratrooper could hardly believe the apparent good fortune he was experiencing. Twice he had nearly been disturbed by sentries, only for them to inexplicably continue on their way past him, as if he'd not been there. It had taken no time at all to catch sight of the large pile of munitions, waiting to be craned aboard one of the two ships that it was moored up alongside. If he could just get within striking distance of those crates, plant the explosives the resistance fighter had given him, then this mission would surely be a success. Checking his wristwatch, and praying this unnatural good fortune could hold for just a few desperate minutes more, he sprinted out across the open, towards the waiting crates. Still basking in the success of the previous evening, Captain Zobel had allowed himself a little extra time in bed before rising that morning. Now, having finished washing and shaving, he was making his way across to his office when the base alarms had suddenly sprung into life all around him. As the men had spilled from the buildings, running for their allocated anti-aircraft positions and fire control points, their commanding officer had attempted to find out what was taking place. A passing NCO had quickly informed him that British aircraft were on approach, a dizzying number, even more than previous raids, before running on to man his post. Standing his ground, Zobel watched on as the artificial foggers on the high ground surrounding the base began to activate, only for his heart to then sink. Several of the devices, right at the heart of the protective array, had failed to ignite. So many malfunctions in such a concentrated area could mean only one thing: sabotage. Hastily, he identified messengers to run to the ships, to pass orders for their commanders to cast off, and moved to the area in the docks where the fog would be more dense. Moments later, having ordered a full search of the docks for any possible saboteur, he heard a series of shots ring out. As the drone of the approaching British aircraft began to rival the howling of the klaxons, Zobel stalked across to the supply gates, where several of his men were now clustered. Shoving them aside, he peered down into the face of the young enemy soldier who lay there, dying. Staring back up at him, a large smile of satisfaction slowly spreading out across his features. With growing horror, the German officer looked from the face of the dying paratrooper across to the crates where he had been found, slowly taking in the warning signs stenciled on the sides of the boxes, that they were packed with explosives and munitions, destined for the ship that was trying to cast off, only meters away. But hardly had he begun to scream the warning to the assembled soldiers, when the whole world ended around them. As they came hurtling into the fjord, the pilots of the British Mosquitoes had prepared themselves for yet another impossible mission. But on this occasion, to their disbelief, they discovered they could not fail to see the two targets that had eluded them on so many other occasions. Already, the protective smoke haze around the dock was noticeably less dense than on previous missions. And to their amazement, it appeared that one of their targets, and the whole of the dock alongside it, were already seemingly ablaze. The flames climbing up into the air, further clearing the smoke screen around it and its sister ship, effectively dooming the pair. An hour later, the old Norwegian sat and looked down upon the two capsized and smoking hulks from his vantage point on the hill. High above him, two ravens flew overhead, unleashing their distinctive calls, what sounded like victory cries, causing a large smile to break across his weathered features. Behind him, the trees parted, and a familiar figure now emerged, scruffy, unkempt, flanked by a pair of young German soldiers. With a wave of his hand, the newcomer angrily dismissed the escorts, both of who would return back down to the base, having no recollection of the encounter. Settling down alongside the older man, he remained silent a minute or two, also taking in the destruction below them, before grudgingly offering his congratulations. The older of the two had continued to smile, accepting the praise, before asking how long it would be before his opponent finally tired of meddling in the affairs of mankind. Rising to his feet, and then welcoming the solitary wolf that had now emerged from the trees to join its master, it had been Fenrir's turn to smile. The older of the two had been playing this game for longer than he, and had enjoyed far greater success, but humanity continued to change around them. Possessing less believers with each passing year, as more and more embraced their own ways of thinking, the All-Father's hold on them would eventually diminish. Once this current ambitious military faction and their enigmatic leader were gone, bested by a global coalition of their peers, a new one would inevitably rise, and then the game could begin again, on a new playing field, with far larger armies and immeasurably more powerful weapons. Then, after a somewhat grudging handshake, the younger of the two deities was gone, leaving Odin to bask in the aftermath of the small victory he had just won.